Please be seated. May the Lord be in my heart and on my lips, that I may worthily proclaim the word. A few years ago, when I was a Jesuit novice, a novice in my religious order, the Jesuits or the Society of Jesus, and on placement in Soweto, South Africa, the townships which at that time were in the midst of the change from the apartheid regime to democracy, and still full of violence and fear. I was invited to take a day out with one of the staff in the school where I was working. On the face of it, it was an exciting prospect. We were going to get out of Soweto for the day, see a bit of neighbouring Johannesburg, and in particular that evening visit friends of his in one of the suburbs. His car would take us there, or at least that was the idea. It started out well, a trip into Johannesburg, a beautiful day, lunch, a wander around the city, and as it got cooler, we headed off towards the suburbs for a barbecue which it turned out never happened, as we managed, and the Jesuit community didn't believe our stupidity afterwards, to spend the next 3 or 4 hours trying to find our destination, we and our trusty South African road map. That map, I can tell you, became the butt of much frustration that evening, as did the South African motorway system, which took us for 10 miles at a time in the increasing gloom before we arrived at an exit, which this time we were determined was the right one, as we got more and more fearful of where eventually we would end up, and if we could get back at all to Soweto. One by one we took those exits, exit 12, 13, 14, 14A, west, east, etc. All, he was sure this time, was the right road. Suffice to say, it wasn't a very pleasant way to spend the evening, a dangerous city, especially at that time, even now, like Johannesburg, not being a place to get more and more lost as our stomachs rumbled on. The petrol gauge got low, and exit after exit took us further away from anywhere remotely resembling home. We got more and more panicky, thought of phoning the police or at least finding a petrol station. And then, eventually, suddenly, out of the night sky, we both realised we were on a road we knew. Yes, there was that funny-looking house and that cinema. Yes, this was a road which we knew, and in 15 minutes or so, provided we took the right turnings, we would get home. And, come to think of it, just to rub it in, we had been on this road twice before that unfortunate evening. Only in our panic and fear we hadn't recognised it, but thought it led somewhere else altogether. So what's the point of this story? If you've ever been badly lost in a strange place, you might begin to share our panic, our searching, our exasperation, and then our jubilation at the moment of realisation of where we were, closer than we realised. As we found, or was it so much as we found purposefully, or that our destination actually crept up on us around a bend in the road, that it somehow found us at our wits' end? The disciples are exactly in this position in this Sunday's Gospel. Most of them, Peter, Andrew, the others, they think they found him, taking that obvious route, guided by their Jewish navigators and by John the Baptist. He's a rabbi, the rabbi. Let's go and see where he lives. But then they changed their mind. We've found the Messiah. But if we read on further to see what happens in the light of day, it's this incredible character, Nathanael, who navigates us to Jesus as the King of Israel. But Jesus, they do not find through their well-planned, expertly thought-out manuals, which, like even the best road maps, tell us the way, but still we get hopelessly lost. No. Jesus finds them. Jesus finds them. One of my keen theological interests from the time I was a student at that best university in Scotland, which will go without naming, has been the Reformation debates on justification, predestination, grace. And I was particularly fascinated in my first studies by the question, how are we saved? It was indeed the key theological factor, it seems to me, for the break in the Reformation. Yes, we can point also to questions about authority, papal infallibility, etc., and certainly to the way the Church had in many ways become corrupt over the last centuries, and issues of politics, both in the English Reformation and north of the border, where different theological battles over the role of religion in society were factors. But the key question in Christian doctrine, for me, centres around how we understand the nature of how we are saved. The question, how are we saved, however, has for me become more and more redundant. Why? Because the search for God, the desire to name God, to encounter the Messiah, is far more adequately addressed when we turn it all around. How did Jesus find us? How did Jesus find us? How does Jesus find us now? The God whose goodness, mercy, unconditional love, welcome to all people is assured if we only notice his presence in our midst and stop trying to work it out. God under our very noses. God in our midst, in all people and in all things. I think for me, one of the factors in that turning around in my spirituality was making retreats, indeed, at university, in daily life. Retreats in the tradition of the founder of my religious order, the Jesuits, St. Ignatius of Loyola, where we're invited to reflect on where God is in my life, how God breaks through in my life, in the everyday, in the facts of life. And indeed, it's no wonder, it seems to me, that this spirituality, through the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, written at a different time in the late 16th century, at the time of the Reformation, and promoted, first of all in just Catholic circles, are now experienced and enjoyed and are an inspiration for so many Christians across different divides. And where I work at the Farm Street, Mount Street Jesuit Centre, we have plenty of these experiences available through Ignatian days, retreats in daily life, spiritual guidance, prayer guides, courses. What's the point? Jesus knows how hard the disciples have been trying to find the way. Jesus knows how hard we've been trying, but it simply doesn't matter to God. The disciples here are all confused and arguing about where he really fits in on the map of the people of Israel. He finds them searching but confused where they are in the bend in the windy road, echoing the words of Samuel, who, remember, 3 times failed to notice the call of the Lord before he said, "Here I am to do your will." "Come and stay," beckons Jesus. "Come home as you are. I have called you in the night. You, Peter, who will go off the rails again. You now are my rock. Lead my people to me." Like every human being, called, lost, and found, we will not find Jesus. We will not find the fulfillment of our lives. We will not get to heaven on earth or in the afterlife on our own. But if we stop, if we realize our frailty but have courage, if just every now and again we manage to calm ourselves when we've got it wrong again, both individually and the Christian church, we will, as the first disciples, find a place of rest, or rather, we will allow that place to find us. We may realize how Jesus is closer to us than we think. St. Ignatius, the founder of my religious order, as many of you will know and have experienced, wrote a manual called the Spiritual Exercises. But it's not a manual in the usual sense or even a road map. It's 4 weeks, which takes us through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and inviting us to place ourselves in these scenes, asking ourselves the key question, where God meets us, where God accompanies us, where God calls us forth as disciples in our own lives. In the first week, to know I am a sinner, yet loved by God. This was something which Martin Luther realized, of course. It has also become Pope Francis' personal motto. The humility to know I can do nothing, absolutely nothing on my own. But as a flawed but graced human being, I am made in God's image and likeness to love and serve him and to bring his kingdom on earth. We are all surely on the same page here, theologically, spiritually, practically, singing from the same hymn sheet of God's wonderful glory to create us in his image and likeness and to love us so much he gave us his Son, in whom we are reborn through his death and resurrection. Thank God, whether through Ignatius or not, we're realizing this as churches together, breaking through any arrogance where there may be within our churches to miss this as a fundamental starting point, that we are sinners, that the churches themselves have sinned institutionally through dividing, condemning, abusing trust, and hopefully realizing that God meets us where we are because he has won victory over sin and death and wants to bring us new life together. God is so much greater than all our petty squabbles of the past. God is infinitely greater. We have the senseless division still between Christians and people of faith, and it reflects how we think of God. The divisions between the Christian churches and other religions. We see around us the distortion of the Islamic religion in the media, the treatment of refugees, creating a culture of fear which whips up suspicion and hatred, rather than finding God in the midst of where we are, trying to understand the other. A God who created us different and who calls us to love our neighbour, to understand and to work for reconciliation between peoples. Not easy. Let us work for reconciliation, for dialogue, for understanding between our traditions and between the Christian churches and other traditions and faiths. Let us work together as Christians whose life is based on hope, based on a God who saves, rooted in Christ, the human face of God, right here in our world, in all its flawed and graced splendour. Let us live our lives together as Christians based on our conviction it is Christ who is our hope, as he expresses the heart of God himself. For he never stops calling us to see him in those around us. He never stops finding us, because he wants us not to be lost in fear, but together home in peace.